Hey, it's Sydney Sweeney. I'm not here to tell you to buy American Eagle jeans. And I definitely won't say that they're the most comfortable jeans I've ever worn. Or that they make your butt look amazing. Why would I need to do that? But if you said that you want to buy the jeans, I'm not going to stop you. But just so we're clear, this is not me telling you to buy American Eagle jeans.
Sydney Sweeney, Hasbury Jeans.
You see what I did there, right?
On WhatsApp, no one can see or hear your personal messages. Whether it's a voice call, message, or sending a password. To WhatsApp, it's all just this. So whether you're sharing the streaming password in the family chat or trading those late-night voice messages that could basically become a podcast, your personal messages stay between you, your friends, and your family. No one else. Not even us. WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone.
Hello everyone, this is Fortune's Wheel and I'm your host Jonathan, and today we are continuing our second Patreon series supporting what's happening on the Public Podcast. This series is called Context of a Conquest. On the Public Podcast, we're taking a deep dive into the Norman conquest of England, but here on Patreon we're asking a few extra questions about it. While the English are undergoing massive cultural, political, religious, and economic transformation, what are Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and other areas directly or indirectly impacted by Duke William's conquest doing? We know the implications of the conquest stretch far beyond England eventually, and we want to try to accurately set up these other areas with the context needed to fully grasp what occurred across the Isles in the late 11th and into the 12th centuries. Today specifically, we get a little personal again, diving into William and Matilda's marriage and how a rift that started off as simple favorites among their children spilled over into outright warfare. This is the context for what's about to happen. I want to sincerely thank you for all of you who are listening to this, as you've generously donated to the production of this podcast and shown that you believe in what's happening here. There are simply no words for my appreciation. So I'll humbly offer another heartfelt thank you. So, back to our second members only series. This is episode 13, entitled Forsaken Son. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Tracy Borman, in her magnificent biography of England's first Norman queen, called Queen of the Conqueror, The Life of Matilda, Wife of William I, wrote, quote, "For the first 25 years of her marriage, Matilda had been a model wife. Loyal, steadfast, and wise, she had proved an exceptionally capable regent and consort, enabling William to both consolidate his victory in England and maintain his hold over Normandy. United by matrimony and ambition, theirs seemed to be an invincible partnership." End quote. But toward the mid to late 1070s, something switched. No one is exactly sure what it was. It could have been her daughter Adela's success and regional notoriety as a nun that spurred her to think bigger. Whether it was the spring of 1070 or as late as 1075 in some records, the death of her second son, Richard, could have caused a dangerous emotional tailspin. Or, as Borman suggests, Matilda had finally, at last, made it to the end of her childbirthing years. This, of course, is a cause for celebration, if only for the fact that surviving a single childbirth was a feat unmatchable by any man. But surviving as many as she had survived, which is probably more than we know considering many newborns or infants died, thus never making it into the records, well, that was just miraculous. Borman's assertion that this change in Matilda's priorities, though she still had young Henry to look after, of course, well, this change in priorities allowed her to stretch her ambitions further than the duchy, which she had already handled masterfully, all things considered. Whatever the change was, Borman writes, quote, "It would transform her from model wife and consort into one of William's deadliest enemies." End quote. Have I got your interest piqued? Robert, eldest son of William and Matilda, enjoyed many, many luxuries in life. Fine wine, abundant food, a warm bed. These were all things that the prestige and wealth that his father had earned on the battlefields across Normandy and his mother had brought with her from Flanders. But the one crucial thing he was missing, the one thing that seemingly eluded him his entire life, was the respect from his father. And this spurred Robert at every step. Born between 1051 and 1053 in Normandy, he was almost immediately set upon by his father. No one really has any firm reason why William didn't take to his firstborn son, but it was clear in the records that he treated him pretty terribly, even going so far as to give him his derogatory nickname of Curthose, meaning short boots or short legs, an obvious jibe at Robert's shorter than normal legs. It's this name that we all remember the boy by today, Robert Curthose. Now, Robert would have a remarkably long life, but in this episode we're going to focus on his young adulthood predominantly. Robert was a horse of many colors, you could say. He was often described as clever and courageous. His combat skills and understanding of military strategies was quite advanced. Physically, though his nickname would suggest otherwise, physically he seems to be quite the specimen of an 11th century Norman warrior. However, he was also quite well known for his casual, almost flippant approach to more important matters. He was prone to lounging around and drinking and enjoying the fruits of his parents' wealth and influence. In fact, by his late teen years, he had amassed a very loyal band of friends who also happened to be the sons of major Norman noblemen, mind you. And they all loved to swing from his coattails. This presents us with an interesting dynamic when you stop and think about it. Robert often disagreed with his father and even more often argued with him, most likely a byproduct of William's treatment of him over the years. This rebelliousness was also seen in others of his generation. His friends' fathers were also men who were close to Duke William, thus exacerbating the rift between the ducal family into the Norman nobility. The sons of William Fitzosborne and Ralph de Tosny, for instance, were a part of Robert's entourage, so by the early to mid-1070s, Normandy was beginning to see the effects of a growing generational conflict brewing. And again, it all started with the relationship between William and Robert Curthose. Now, it didn't help that Robert was also far closer to his mother, Matilda, than with William. But again, there's just so much we don't know. Was this simply a byproduct of William's attitude toward Robert, and Robert influenced his friends similarly? These are questions we can only wish to have answers to, nothing more. But Robert's close relationship with Matilda certainly didn't help things, and this would play a major role in future events, so just hang on to that. This lack of self-control with regards to indulgence has side effects of its own. For instance, if you choose to sit around and drink and complain all day, then there's a pretty good chance you're going to develop a strong sense of resentment. And resentment is a very dangerous thing to possess. It clouds your judgment and forces you into solutions that may not, on the outside, seem very rational or practical. Resentment breeds vengeance for perceived trespasses against you. And Robert seemed to seethe with resentment toward his father. And as I said before, this resentment no doubt travels like wildfire among those who hang on your every word. It's a dangerous, dangerous game to play. And the game becomes even more dangerous the higher up the social and political and economic hierarchy you climb. As the higher you find yourself on such ladders, the more people you tend to affect around you. Robert was just one step removed from the top. And after 1066, he wasn't just one step away from the top of a duchy, but he was also one step away from the top of an entire kingdom. What comes with such resentment is a weakness toward others who offer you ways to exercise your resentment. Robert was quickly becoming a pawn in a much larger game, whether he was aware of it or not. Now, around 1056, William had begun his search for a wife for 5-year-old Robert. Now, strangely, this responsibility was one of any nobleman or king's greatest responsibilities, as marriage alliances could forge new bonds with polities both locally and even far beyond. The county of Anjou, on the other side of the county of Maine, which lay along William's southern border, well, they were still throwing little fits about the Norman duke's power and reputation. They'd been at it for well over a decade by 1061, and William was tiring of the nuisance because that's what it had become, a nuisance that he had to deal with every couple years. He'd even humiliated the French king who sided with the Angevin leader, Geoffrey the Hammer Martel, which I swear has to be a WWE wrestler's name. At some point, somebody's got to take it. One way to buffer this threat was to not allow Maine to fall into Martel's hands. And the Count of Maine happened to have a little sister of marriageable age, a young girl around Robert's age named Margaret. Thus, the betrothal of Margaret to Robert proved beneficial for both Maine and Normandy, and the families could only sit and wait a few more years until the Pope would allow the marriage. I mean, I know it's shocking, but even the Pope thought that 10, 11 years old was a bit too young for marriage. Unfortunately, during this waiting period, Margaret suddenly fell ill, and she died in 1060, thus breaking the betrothal and any semblance of bonds between the duchy and the county. This was precisely the crack that Anjou was looking for, as such a marriage bond would have proved disastrous for Anjou's prospects of expansion and putting an end to the bastard Norman Duke once and for all. Now, what's more is that in the same year, Margaret's older brother, Count Herbert II of Maine, well, he also died. Now, William, being William, tried a little trickery, a little tomfoolery, if you will, and claimed that since his son was betrothed to Margaret, and both Margaret and her brother died so close together, then, well, of course William should inherit Maine as his own. Was this training wheels for him claiming the throne of England too? Well, this was how William took the county of Maine. He used his son to gain a foothold. As we know, in 1063, 3 years before Hastings, William finally cushioned his southern border by taking the county of Maine, wresting it away from both the Maine nobility as well as from Anjou. This effectively quieted the always annoying Angevins just one county south. A county that had given William fits for a couple decades again. But I mean, at the end of the day, land equaled wealth and power. So it also effectively proved that William was a man not to be trifled with. Not just militarily, but also now financially. And though he and Robert weren't always on the best of terms, he handed Robert the title of Count of Maine that year in 1063. Though it was outside of the duchy and outside of any serious complications in regards to William's standing in the duchy, it was also a test, in my estimation. But that didn't mean William just left Robert to deal with Maine, though. No, it was too strategically important to trust the boy, in William's estimation. William still made certain decisions within the county, which certainly stepped on Robert's toes a bit, maybe souring the relationship between father and son a bit more. For instance, Le Mans, which is in Maine, in 1065, well into Robert's tenure, about a year and a half, 2 years in, William went right over his son's head and appointed a Norman bishop to its powerful church. He also negotiated a pretty important relationship between Normandy and Anjou around that time as well. See, as of 1060, the threat of Geoffrey the Hammer Martel went away in an instant when Martel died. In life, Martel groomed his 2 nephews, Geoffrey le Barbu, also known as Geoffrey III of Anjou, or Geoffrey the Bearded, and Fulk le Rachine, also known as Fulk III of Anjou, or Fulk the Black, as Angevin knights, but upon death, though records indicate he preferred Fulk over Geoffrey, the county of Anjou was left to Geoffrey the Bearded. Now we're going to hear more about them in another episode. There are so many rabbit holes we could go down here. France in the 11th century was a veritable warren of intrigue and relationships and wars. But we'll try to keep it in the context of Normandy for this series of episodes, and Robert Curthose specifically here. But I'm not going to lie, that's going to be tough. So pardon me if I go on a brief tangent from time to time. Anyway, when in 1060 Geoffrey Martel died and his nephew Geoffrey the Bearded took over as count, it was clear to Angevin noblemen that Geoffrey the Bearded was no hammer, causing the new Geoffrey to seek support from anywhere he could get it, even if it meant Normandy. That's right. In either 1064 or 65, Count Geoffrey the Bearded was approached by William's men with an offer. Count Robert Curthose of Maine would now pay homage to him in exchange for an indefinite release of the threat of hostilities coming from Anjou. This wouldn't put Robert lower on the hierarchy than Geoffrey the Bearded, but having to pay tribute, so to speak, to him certainly put Robert at a disadvantage. This move no doubt stung Robert to the core. How could his father put him in such a position when he was trying to make a name for himself in order to one day take the duchy over and rule even more effectively than the old man? It was almost as if he were being punished. It was this sort of thing that continued to form cracks in the ducal family's facade over the next decade. It would only take a decade more of this treatment before those cracks finally snapped and a tectonic shift would occur in northern France, upending all William had built during his tenure. From 1063 on, William would have Robert present at more and more charter sightings, sending one clear message, and this was good for Robert. Robert was the de facto heir to all of his father's domains. Famed historian Frank Barlow, in his biographical tome, simply titled William Rufus, writes, quote, "Moreover, King Philip I of France, who was only 14 in 1066, had consented to the grant." End quote. Now, Barlow mentions the near-death experiences William had survived through 1069, including his severe illness in Bonneville and the many and various battles in England. And Barlow adds, quote, "Robert became in a way Duke of Normandy concurrently with his father, probably being regarded during his father's absences in England as the Prince Regent on the continent." End quote. And at this point, I ask a serious question. How much of Robert's image is Matilda's responsibility? Though their second son, Richard, was beloved by both parents almost equally, Robert was most certainly a mama's boy. Now, we know that the year 1069 brought terrible news from Normandy's southern border to William's ears. Robert had lost the county of Maine to some local noblemen. Just as William's issues in Yorkshire ramped up and the likes of Hereward the Wake were beginning to rise up in outright revolution, William had to grapple with Robert losing his only buffer against the still dangerous county of Anjou. Back on the continent, Robert could only sit back and watch as the people of Maine grew in their unrest at having to serve a Norman bastard's upstart son instead of their own ruler. Now, how much of Maine's fall from Normandy's grip was Robert's responsibility for exactly? Probably quite a bit of it, to be honest. If you remember, William sent a shockwave of fear through the county when, just a decade earlier, he had maimed and disfigured the defenders of Alençon for merely mocking his mother from the ramparts of the walled city. Domfront, soon after, surrendered before William even arrived, having heard the stories. It's worth noting that both fortified cities, rather important trading hubs for the region too, were under the control of the influential Belem family. And the Belems, who were coerced into serving Norman interests for a decade or two afterwards, well, they're going to appear in our story later. After the uprising and expulsion of Norman forces, the people of Maine chose Hugh V in 1070 to rule them. This was mentioned in the last episode about Matilda. Now, Hugh V was the son of a Milanese nobleman and Hugh V's aunt, Gersendis. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for them to realize how inept he was at running a lemonade stand, let alone a county. Orderic Vitalis writes of him, quote, "He was indeed an imbecile, a coward, and an idler, and totally unfit to hold the reins of government in so high a station." End quote. Ouch. The nobility put up with him as count for quite a while, however, but they did it in such a way as to make him a figurehead only. They did what they wanted, conspired with who they wanted, and the county of Maine was really in their hands, not Hugh V's. But finally, and we're going to jump way ahead just to finish out Hugh's story here, finally, in 1093, Hugh's cousin, Elias, made an offer he couldn't refuse. Whatever that entailed, your guess is as good as mine, and Elias actually bought off Hugh V and took control as Count Elias I of Maine. Now, somewhere in there, it's worth pointing out that another powerful Norman looking to the county of Maine to expand Norman influence, Robert Guiscard, managed to secure a marriage between Count Hugh V and his daughter Gersent. This guy, Hugh, was so ridiculous that between 1088 and 1093, he realized he couldn't even handle a marriage and divorced her, prompting an excommunication by Pope Urban II. So yeah, anyway, back to our story of Robert Curthose. I warned you I might stray. This was the guy that Robert lost Maine to. Not a good look. Between 1070 and 1072, William was forced back to Normandy, having just harried the north of England, put down the formidable Hereward the Wake, and ran off the King of Denmark. Was England really in a position to be left? Well, no, of course not. William couldn't turn his head without a rebellion breaking out across the island. But Maine was strategically important, and the fact that his son lost it in a matter of just 6 years was one humiliation too far for the proud Duke/King. During those 2 years, not only was the Maine situation important enough to call his attention home, but the county of Anjou was again under new management. The youngest nephew, once groomed by Geoffrey Martel, took the reins there. His name was Fulk III, or Fulk the Black. And Count Fulk the Black, well, he wanted Maine. But obviously so did William. So once again, Maine was ground zero for a clash between two behemoth regions within the Kingdom of France. Now, while William pushed back into Maine, it seems as if the Angevins were gathering support from the French king and the Britons, and things weren't looking too great for the conqueror at this point. Historian Frank Barlow writes, quote, "From 1072, when Fulk of Anjou took the city of Le Mans, the capital of Maine, William was on the defensive, struggling to keep intact what he had just inherited and acquired." End quote. We've followed William's story for quite some time, haven't we? We've learned of his horrific upbringing culminating in a switch finally being tripped that resulted in the young Duke seeing red and chasing his opposing Normans to their deaths at Valesdune. Then he sought a bride who then rejected him, resulting him in snapping and riding full bore to her father's estate, kicking the crap out of her as she exited Sunday Mass, and then her accepting his marriage proposal. When defenders of Alençon and Maine mocked his mother, he flipped and cut their ears and noses off in front of the walls. At Exeter, years later, he reacted similarly to taunts by the men who stood the walls of the city he felt was rightfully his. Upon word of Earl Harold Godwinson's donning of the English crown, he lost his temper and amassed an invasion force, and before the year was out, he was wearing that same crown. When the English north had pestered him enough, he torched the place and left hundreds of thousands dead, their corpses left rotting for decades on the roads crisscrossing the region. What's my point here? My point is to once again show that there was something in William's wiring that caused him to, well, just snap. William's tantrums were no secret to anyone, but the number of times he truly had one left those around him on edge, without question. Now, who would be the next one to suffer one of William's infamous blow-ups? Well, that award would go to Count Fulk III of Anjou, there in the fall of 1073. It was after the capture of Le Mans that William blew the lid off of Fulk the Black's success. In fact, William blew a gasket when he learned that Le Mans had fallen in the first place, and haunted by his regret for ever giving Robert the county, he reacted in typical William fashion. He did what it took to regain the city, and thus the power structure of Maine. And the Norman chroniclers were strangely quiet about this engagement, which is a clear indication that it was probably a pretty gruesome affair. During William's work in Maine in the early 1070s, Robert found himself humiliated and in an even darker place in his father's eyes. So Robert began to cultivate a cult of personality, if you will. This was when he began attracting many of the sons of Norman nobility to his side, as mentioned earlier. Now, what else was he to do but sit around enjoying the fruits of his father's labors and complain about the state of things under his father's rule? Essentially, Robert began biting the hand that fed him. This continued for years, and though he was a part of some major events in both Normandy as well as England, he never relented on his excesses and complaints. And in 1077, it would all boil over into outright rebellion.
Shh. Hear that? Big waves are calling. Dive into refreshment with Kona Big Wave. Tropical flavor and the taste of aloha in every drop. This summer, don't just listen. Join Kona on the Big Wave Bonfire Tour. More information at konabigwave.com/bigwavemusic. Kona Big Wave. Liquid aloha. Copyright 2025 Kona Brewing Co., St. Louis, Missouri. Mahalo for enjoying responsibly.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
A massage chair might seem a bit extravagant, especially these days. 8 different settings, adjustable intensity, plus it's heated, and it just feels so good. Yes, a massage chair might seem a bit extravagant, but when it can come with a car, suddenly it seems quite practical. The all-new 2025 Volkswagen Tiguan, packed with premium features like available massaging front seats, it only feels extravagant.
But before we hit up 1077, it's worth mentioning that it's not like there was just this easy jump in our timeline for Robert. Have you ever made a mistake and then had to live with it until its effects played out? Like, you have to wait until other people take care of your mess? I'm thinking of that classic Stanley Kubrick flick, Full Metal Jacket, when Vincent D'Onofrio's character, Private Pyle, was forced to watch his squad members do hours of PT while he just sat in front of them sucking his thumb with his cap to the side, all because he couldn't remember to do certain things correctly. That's kind of how I imagine Robert passing his time after losing Maine and having to watch his father clean up his mess. William crisscrossed Normandy and Maine for a number of years, while also keeping in close communication with the French king, King Philip I, his noblemen holding down England in his absence, and just about anyone else he thought might be useful in his present circumstances. By 1072, when Count Fulk the Black of Anjou took Maine's capital of Le Mans, William was on his back foot, a place William was hardly used to being on, though there were moments in England recently where he got really close to it. In fact, the fighting that William engaged in to secure Le Mans again, taking it forcibly from the Angevins, it culminated in 1073, and it took a lot out of William. Around this time in 1073, things in England began to visibly relax just a bit, as well as his hard work in securing Maine was showing signs of success with every week. However, in 1074, a French neighbor, Count Ralph IV of Amiens, Valois, and the Vexin passed away. Barlow writes, quote, "His son, Simon of Crepy, William's nursling, resisted valiantly Philip of France's attempts to deprive him of his father's conquests and his inheritance, and within a year or two, with papal support, had been confirmed in his titles." End quote. So it seems that by 1074, King Philip had joined in efforts against, well, maybe not William directly, but certainly those who paid homage to him, like the Count of Amiens, Valois, and the Vexin. William no doubt prepped himself and his fellow Normans for possible actions against their king, again, between 1074 and 1075. And speaking of 1075, back in England, trouble began bubbling to the surface when William declined to allow a marriage between his westernmost earl and his easternmost earl's daughter. This would have created a massive block of power within his kingdom, a kingdom he'd already spilled far too much time, blood, and coin on, subduing in his name. He wasn't about to create another House of Godwin to contend with, like Edward II had done decades earlier. Unfortunately for William, his earls didn't listen, and they even attracted the support of the last Anglo-Saxon earl in the kingdom, one Earl Wulftheof of Northumbria. With the situation still heavy in and around Maine, William couldn't conceivably leave. In addition, William had already heard word that his brother-in-law back in Flanders, Count Robert the Frisian, had all but come right out and publicly condemned William. Well, it wasn't quite that dramatic, but the message was still the same. By marrying his stepdaughter, Bertha of Holland, to King Philip I of France, and his daughter to Saint Canute of Denmark, well, Robert the Frisian had connected his family to both Denmark and French royalty, both a direct threat to William's rule, not just in Normandy, but in England as well. And besides all of that, however, there was trouble brewing far closer to home. And I'm not referring to Normandy. I'm talking about William's own family. Seemingly innocuous events had caught the duchy and its ducal family completely off guard. And it all started with someone taking a dump in a metal container. Well, they called it a chamber pot. It was the medieval equivalent to a bedpan. At least that's what we call it here in the States. I don't really know about anywhere else. Just in case context is needed, a bedpan, chamber pot, whatever, is a container found beneath hospital beds for patients who can't, make it to the loo. Do you all know that series of stories for preschool and elementary age kids about, if you give a moose a muffin or if you give a mouse a whatever, Basically, if you give these creatures a something, then it sets off a string of incidents that are just ridiculous and nearly unbelievable, or outright unbelievable, if it weren't for the pictures in the books illustrating what has ensued. Yeah. So Robert Curthose's first revolt against William, it was a lot like those books. Now, on the first page of this imaginary children's book here, on the first page it shows a young man kicking his feet up on a wooden table, his buddies all around him in various seats and positions, all lounging, hanging on his every word. He is certainly the center of attention, and in the dim candlelight this young man named Robert has a scowl on his face, clearly in the middle of sharing a story with his mates. Those around him wear faces of varying amusement. Turn the page. And now we see a smaller version of the same scene, from above, as seen through the cracks of floorboards. In the foreground are the silhouettes of the backs of two heads. Turn the page. We see who these figures are now. They're whispering to one another in the even dimmer light, identifying each other by their names, William and Henry. They are conspiring to play a trick on the man directly below them, telling stories. They agree on something. Turn the page. If you give two precocious little brothers a full chamber pot, then you have to deal with the mess that they make with it. The two boys working together as the chamber pot is pretty heavy, of course. Upturn the chamber pot directly over the head of that man below, their older brother, spilling yellowish brown liquid, well, mostly liquid, through the spaces in the floorboards. Turn the page. Well, you can imagine where it goes from there. Covered in excrement, Robert runs upstairs and drags the two boys down by their collars. He promptly beats both of them, bloodying their faces and blackening their eyes. Huge bruises begin forming all over the boys' bodies. Turn the page. During the chaos, someone had run to get the Duke just a few houses down. However, the din was so loud that William was already coming out of the doors, angrily demanding what was going on. Turn the page. He barges in, a towering presence in the little room. His shoulders seem to expand and touch the walls on either side. He looms over his three sons, one on top of the other two, throwing punches and driving in his knees. He pulls the oldest boy off and realizes the stench emanating from him. A fight between father and eldest son ensues, resulting in Robert and his buddies storming out and riding out of the city. It turns out that Robert rode straight to Rouen the next night, collecting others along the way, and it took a matter of hours before William woke up to the news that Robert was currently laying siege to Rouen. Now, it wasn't much of a siege at all, but the people of Rouen refused him on account of him being in open revolt against their duke. Subsequently, the mere mention of William riding toward Rouen sent Robert and his friends packing. We don't know exactly in 1077 how and when this happened, but we can draw closer to a time of year, though. See, the ducal family had two major events that year. The first was the consecration of William's half-brother Odo's cathedral in Bayeux on July 14. The other was on September 13 in Caen, during the consecration of William's pet project, St. Stephen's Cathedral. I presume that this prank gone bad occurred while the family was together in Caen sometime just after September 13th. Between William and Robert, it all went downhill from there. So I suppose the lesson here is that if you give two little brothers an overflowing chamber pot, they will kick off a years-long hot and cold rebellion between arguably the most powerful man in Northern Europe and his eldest son. Sounds like a bestseller if you ask me. So let's zoom out for a moment and see the situation for what it was. Robert was already on the outs with his father, invaded another kingdom, became its king, and spent years away from home. The time he did spend at home, this father, was spent parading English dignitaries around like mere spoils of war, or trying to fix what he, that is, Robert, had messed up in Maine. There wasn't much quality father-son time spent, as you can imagine. Now, during William's frequent absences, Robert had attracted, as mentioned previously, quite the cadre of young men to his side. It was a generational divide, if there ever was one. Borman writes, quote, "Free from the shackles of his father's overbearing authority, Robert was indulging in a life of excess. His company became notorious for disillusion and debauchery, as etiquette and ceremonials gave way to pleasure and lasciviousness. As well as jesters and other entertainers, his entourage included prostitutes of both sexes. Orderic Vitalis decried the loose morals that existed in Robert's court and criticized his followers for their effeminate appearance. Their long hair and extravagant clothes contrasted sharply with the clipped military style of the Conqueror's entourage." End quote. In William Rufus, written by historian Frank Barlow, he goes a step further and describes it like this, quote, "Robert, now 24 and a knight bachelor, was the leader of a band of Juvenis, mostly the companions of his youth, and was in most unwilling dependence on his father. Orderic Vitalis, a prejudiced observer, considered Robert's company licentious and afflicted with undesirable hangers-on, jongleurs, parasites, and whores. By parasite, he probably meant a male prostitute. Robert himself was shortly to give adequate proof of his heterosexual interests, but sodomy was rife in a society which set much store on single-sex communities, whether in armies or in the militia Christi, and a movement to repress it was developing in the church. The king, who was parsimonious and puritanical, cannot have approved of William's conduct, but he is unlikely to have tried to keep a soldier's son on too tight a rein. Indeed, he seems to have treated the young man with indulgence, even if constricted by meanness and laced with mockery. And the queen was fondness itself." End quote. The Robert described by one and all seems to have played the role of spoiled brat, with a flair for the forsaken son to a T. Most importantly, though, it seems that Robert Curthose was playing the leader rather than being one. In my estimation, there are serious parallels to our own time, a time defined by generational divides and good times earned by tough men, but squandered by weak ones. A time of weak people pretending to be leaders rather than actually being a leader. Worse, we find Robert, by the mid-1070s, was not only the leader of a dangerous entourage of fellow disgruntled sons of powerful Norman men, but they, described by Orderic Vitalis as, quote-unquote, a swarm of obsequious sycophants. As Borman states, quote, flattered Robert's vanity and encouraged the more rebellious aspects of his nature. End quote. In short, these yes-men fed Robert's ego and stoked the flames of hatred toward his father, beyond which were already flaring up. Barlow writes, quote, everyone agreed that Robert was a fine soldier, skillful and brave, with a generous nature, winning ways, and a plausible tongue. But when he began to demand from his father greater independence, perhaps effective rule over both Maine and Normandy, he only aroused the king's suspicions, anger, and utter and stubborn rejection. End quote. A tale as old as time, right? Barlow adds this final touch about William. The king, quote-unquote, was never a victim of charm. And it seems Robert was quite the charmer. Now back to Cain in 1077. This incident, the one when two younger brothers decided to dump a chamber pot, some say they simply urinated on Robert and his friends below, but I like the chamber pot version much better personally. Over their elder brother in front of his buddies, all that. So after William arrived and put a swift halt to the beating of two future kings of England, let's not forget that small detail, and made the brothers hug it out full house style, the next night, surely egged on by his cronies, or, as Orderic Vitalis writes, sycophants, Robert Curthose rode off into the night. At first, no one knew where he was headed. But again, as we've said before, within hours, though, William had something else to worry about. The keep at Rouen was apparently under siege. I'm going to do something a little different here, and I'm going to pick this story up on the main podcast. I hope I've created the context for what's about to happen, because William's about to feel the threat quite close to home. The type of threat that might overwhelm and outweigh any external threat. When family turns on you, one tends to run out of options quite quickly, especially if you're the parent. I'm hoping to feed this episode, this Patreon episode, directly into a very short miniseries as we begin wrapping up this entire bend in the narrative about William's conquest of England. This mini-series is called Everybody Hates Will. Now, episode 94 on the public podcast will cover the Revolt of the Earls, which is happening concurrently with this episode. However, episode 95 will pick up where this Patreon episode left off, titled Everybody Hates Will, A Continental Conspiracy. Episode 96 will break off a bit and discuss land ownership issues in England, which are coming to a head between a clash between Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury and Bishop Odo of Bayeux. But we jump right back on the Everybody Hates Will series with Robert's Rebellion on episode 97. We'll see how this goes, but I've had a blast researching it and putting it all together for you. Thank you for listening and supporting the show. Until next time.